Listen carefully, because the most dangerous part of Saudi Arabia's nuclear question is that people keep treating it like a future headline. Will they or won't they build the bomb? That framing is already obsolete. The real story is that Saudi Arabia has been assembling something more efficient than a bomb, something that can function like a nuclear shield without paying the full political, technical, or diplomatic price of crossing the line. And here's the claim that flips the whole region into a different category. Saudi Arabia is trying to buy deterrence the way empires buy insurance, by outsourcing the ultimate threat to someone else while keeping its own hands clean, its economy open, and its leverage intact. Not accidental, not emotional, not improvisation. It's the predictable output of a repeating multi-step pattern you can see across history. When a regional order becomes unstable, when guarantees become questionable, and when the cost of building your own ultimate defense becomes too high, states don't always sprint toward a bomb. They sprint toward something smarter. A zero-signature deterrent arrangement, a shield you can deny, a shield you can activate, a shield you can afford. Now lock in the authority check, because without numbers you can't see the machine. The IMF has warned that global debt levels remain extremely elevated, well over 200% of world GDP, and that kind of leverage narrows everyone's margin for error. In that world, crisis management stops being a temporary mode. It becomes a permanent condition. And when debt loads look like that, alliances don't behave like morality plays. They behave like balance sheets. Credibility becomes a priced asset. Security becomes a negotiated instrument. And the nuclear question becomes a bargaining chip inside a larger system of guarantees, choke points, and fiscal constraints. Here's the inevitability statement, and I want it to land cold. In a world where trust is declining and deterrence is expensive, the outcome is mathematically inevitable. The system does not reward purity. It rewards risk transfer. It rewards plausible deniability. It rewards insurance that you can turn on without admitting you bought it. So when you hear Saudi nuclear program, don't picture a desert test site. Picture a contract. And that contract, call it the $0 nuclear shield, changes the Middle East because it doesn't require Saudi Arabia to become a declared nuclear state to act like a protected one. Now, before you argue with me, I'm going to define the pattern like a mechanism, fixed, chronological, repeatable. Once you see it, you'll start recognizing it everywhere because it shows up in empires, alliances, currency regimes, and war guarantees. First comes the foundation. A state sits on a strategic asset the world cannot easily replace. Energy, a choke point, a geographic hinge, a finance pipeline, a religious axis, or an alliance position. In this phase, security feels handled by an external patron or by the assumption that the old order will keep holding. The state doesn't need ultimate deterrence yet because the system still feels stable. Then comes expansion and overextension. Threats multiply. The security patron gets stretched. Wars, domestic politics, debt, global commitments. The cost of maintaining credibility rises. The client state gains wealth and influence, but also gains enemies and vulnerabilities. And here's the subtle moment that matters. The client state begins to realize the patron's promises are subject to politics, elections, fatigue, and competing priorities. Then comes the fracture. A shock hits the region, wars, drone attacks, proxy escalation, regime changes, a sudden shift in global priorities. The client state watches the patron hesitate, bargain, delay, or redirect attention. This is where credibility cracks. Not fully, but enough. And in deterrence, enough is the whole point. If attackers believe the guarantee might fail, the guarantee is already priced lower. And then comes the inevitable outcome, the hedge. But here's the key revelation. Hedging does not always mean build a bomb tomorrow. Hedging means building options. It means building a layered deterrence stack. Conventional modernization, missile defense, alliances, economic leverage, and crucially, a pathway to nuclear protection, either through latent capability, a quiet umbrella arrangement with someone who already has the weapon, or structured ambiguity that forces rivals to plan for your worst case. That is the pattern. Foundation, overextension, fracture, hedge. Now I'm going to prove this with 3 historical case studies. Not to narrate history like a museum tour, but to show you the mechanism. Because once you accept the mechanism, the present stops looking confusing. It starts looking inevitable. First, West Germany and Japan. After World War II, the modern outsourced deterrence model. Start at the foundation. 1945 leaves Germany and Japan devastated, occupied, politically constrained. Their strategic value is enormous. Industrial capacity, geography, and the ability to anchor the post-war order. But they are not allowed the full sovereign toolkit, especially not independent military power. They are strategically central, yet structurally limited. Now the overextension phase. As the Cold War hardens, the United States extends security guarantees across Europe and Asia. This is not charity, it's system design. The U.S. builds an architecture, alliances, bases, commitments, deterrence lines. But every new commitment becomes a future test. Credibility becomes expensive because credibility only exists if you pay for it when it's tested. Now, the fracture tension. The Soviet Union has conventional mass and nuclear capability. The fear is simple. If West Germany or Japan believes the U.S. won't trade New York for Hamburg or Los Angeles for Tokyo, those states will seek their own ultimate deterrent. And here's the detail that matters. The crisis isn't one single event. The crisis is the permanent tension of extended deterrence. You're asking a patron to risk annihilation for you. Now the hedge outcome, the U.S., chooses a solution cheaper than proliferation. Provide the nuclear umbrella, forward deployments, and alliance integration so allies don't build their own bombs. The guarantee becomes a non-proliferation tool. The allies accept dependence in exchange for protection and economic revival. The patron accepts risk in exchange for order, not moral, mechanical, cost minimization. Second, Libya, 2003-2011, the credibility trap that taught the opposite lesson. Foundation first. Libya is isolated, sanctioned, treated as a rogue state. It wants regime security. It explores WMD options, not because it loves apocalypse, but because it wants deterrence, insurance against invasion or coercion. Now, overextension. After 9/11 and the Iraq invasion, the U.S.-led order appears assertive. The message many regimes hear is not cooperate and you'll be safe. The message is we can remove you. The perceived cost of being outside the system rises. So regimes begin asking a rational question. What keeps us alive when the system turns hostile? Now the fracture point. Libya chooses a bargain. It gives up its WMD programs in exchange for reintegration. It trades deterrence capability for security through normalization. It's a deal. Now the outcome, and this is the brutal lesson. In 2011, Libya's regime collapses amid intervention and conflict. Whatever your politics, the structural effect is clear. Regimes around the world update their deterrence calculus. They look at the sequence and conclude, giving up your ultimate insurance can increase vulnerability if external protection is conditional, reversible, or subject to shifting political winds. That credibility trap spreads. It whispers to every leader, your safety cannot rely on promises that can be rewritten. So even when a state does not want a bomb, it wants an option, a path, a lever, something that cannot be taken away by a changing mood in foreign capitals. Third, Ukraine and the lesson of paper assurances. Foundation. The Soviet Union collapses. Ukraine inherits a huge nuclear arsenal on its territory, but it does not retain it as a fully independent, mature deterrent. It sits at the edge of an evolving order where rules are being rewritten. Overextension. The West expands institutions and frameworks using diplomacy and economic integration as stabilizers. Security assurances are offered as a substitute for nuclear retention. The logic is familiar. Reduce proliferation risk, pull states into a rules-based order, trade weapons for promises. Fracture. When conflict and territorial disputes reemerge, assurance and guarantee stop sounding the same. The difference becomes tangible. Limits become visible. Every state watching sees that paper commitments can be interpreted, delayed, constrained, or scaled. Outcome. The system learns again, when existential risk returns, states hedge. Some hedge by militarizing, some by joining alliances, some by pursuing latent nuclear capability, some by seeking a patron with a credible umbrella. The key is not the specific choice. The key is the direction, away from trust, toward options. Now compress all three cases into one line, because this is the machine. Whenever the credibility of protection declines, the demand for deterrence rises. And if building your own deterrent is too costly, you outsource it. Now we apply it to Saudi Arabia, step by step, like a cold audit. No mythology, no vibes, just structure. And as we move, you're going to hear the checkpoints, because this is how you confirm a system is repeating. Foundation first. Saudi Arabia is not just a state, it's a strategic platform. Energy capacity, pricing power, investment flows, geographic weight, and symbolic authority through religious sites. For decades, its security relationship with the United States formed the backbone of its external defense posture. The deal was implicit, stability and energy market alignment in exchange for protection and partnership. But as the threat environment evolves, missiles, drones, proxies, cyber, and a more multipolar world, the old foundation becomes less certain. Oil is still central, but in a different way. It's a shock absorber and a shock amplifier. Prices stabilize governments, and price spikes can destabilize everyone. Check. Now the overextension phase, where the patron's credibility becomes expensive. The United States has to manage multiple theaters: domestic politics, fiscal constraints, and public fatigue. In a high-debt era, every long-term commitment competes with internal priorities. That does something subtle but decisive. It injects conditionality into promises, even if nobody says it out loud. And Saudi leaders aren't only listening to speeches, they're watching bandwidth. They're watching whether attention can pivot, whether priorities can change, whether security becomes negotiable. This is the moment where client states start thinking like insurers. They ask one question: what happens to me if the guarantor is busy somewhere else? Verified. Now the fracture signals. Crisis doesn't have to mean invasion. Crisis can be a series of moments that reveal limits, attacks that test defenses, proxy escalation that exposes vulnerabilities, sudden diplomatic recalibrations, public disagreements, slow responses, mixed messages. Each moment chips away at the same thing: certainty. This is where Saudi Arabia begins behaving like every state in every credibility crisis. It builds redundancy. One redundancy is conventional: air defense, precision strike capacity, intelligence, and internal security. Another is diplomatic: reducing single-point dependence, widening relationships, increasing negotiating leverage across multiple powers. But here is the deeper signal, the one that almost always appears before a state shifts its deterrence posture. Riyadh keeps emphasizing a civil nuclear pathway, and, crucially, the right to control the fuel cycle, including enrichment. And in plain language, enrichment is not just power generation. Enrichment is timeline control. Enrichment is leverage. Enrichment is latency. When a state insists on enrichment, it isn't just buying electricity. It's buying the ability to shorten the distance to something else, if the environment forces it. Undeniable. Now we arrive at the outcome, the architecture of the $0 nuclear shield. And this is where your retention rises if you make it feel concrete, not abstract. So picture deterrence as a layered stack, like floors in a building. Saudi Arabia does not need to move into the top floor officially. It only needs rivals to believe the elevator exists and the power is on. First layer, latent capability. A civil nuclear pathway plus fuel cycle ambition creates an option. Even if the option is never used, the option changes other people's behavior. It forces rivals to plan around your potential future, not just your current reality. Second layer, external cover. Security relationships with nuclear-armed partners create strategic ambiguity. Even if nobody announces umbrella, the signal lands. In a crisis, Saudi Arabia may not be alone at the top level. Third layer, bargaining leverage with the primary patron. Negotiating cooperation, security frameworks, and broader guarantees increases Saudi leverage because it turns protection into a competitive market. The message is simple: if you won't structure this with us, others will. Fourth layer, the public red line narrative. If Iran goes nuclear, we will follow. That statement matters not because it guarantees action, but because it creates a declared contingency. It tells every rival and every partner there's a threshold where latency turns into speed. Add the stack together, and you see the $0 nuclear shield concept. Saudi Arabia doesn't need to detonate anything to change the equation. It needs to create a credible belief that, in extremis, it can either become nuclear capable faster than you want, or sit under a nuclear umbrella faster than you expect, while keeping formal status ambiguous enough to avoid immediate punishment. And because the whole stack can be framed as civil energy plus defense cooperation, the diplomatic cost can be delayed, negotiated, distributed, and softened. That's the deal that changes the Middle East. Deterrence without confession. Now I'm going to run the cold checklist again, because this is where inevitability hits. Strategic asset foundation, energy and regional leverage. Check. Patron credibility strain in a high debt world. High leverage compresses flexibility, raises the price of guarantees, and forces prioritization. Check. Fracture signals that encourage hedging. Regional instability plus visible limits of any single guarantor. Verified. Hedging through options, latency, and outsourced deterrence, fuel cycle ambition, strategic ambiguity, and leverage building across multiple channels. Undeniable. Now, the implication, and this is the part you want the viewer to feel in their chest. A $0 nuclear shield can reduce visible conflict in the short run by raising the cost of aggression. But it can increase hidden volatility in the long run because it pushes every rival toward the same logic. If Saudi Arabia gains nuclear-backed deterrence without becoming a declared nuclear state, Iran recalculates, Israel recalculates, Turkey recalculates, Egypt recalculates. The region becomes a grid of overlapping ambiguities instead of a clear hierarchy. And ambiguity is not peace. Ambiguity is bargaining on the edge of miscalculation because the lines blur. The line between warning and commitment blurs. The line between symbolic relationship and operational guarantee blurs. The line between civil nuclear and latent nuclear blurs. And in a crisis, blurred lines don't slow escalation. They accelerate it because everyone assumes the other side might have a hidden backstop. That is why this isn't a niche policy story. It's an architecture shift. Now let's dismiss the comforting myths, because myths are where viewers relax, and relaxation kills retention. Myth 1. Guarantees always hold. No. Guarantees hold when interests align and costs are bearable. When costs rise, promises become conditional, quietly. Myth 2. Technology will save us. Technology changes tactics. It doesn't change incentives. It often intensifies the incentives by making attack cheaper and defense harder. Myth 3. This time is different because everyone understands the risks. History is full of intelligent people who understood risk. The machine still ran because incentives still push states toward hedging, leverage, and survival. So what's the practical takeaway? First, stop consuming the Middle East as isolated headlines. Start reading it as a system of contracts, security contracts, energy contracts, credibility contracts. The most important moves are often the boring ones that change incentives quietly. Fuel cycle rights, defense language, treaty framing, civil agreements that alter strategic timelines. Second, track latency indicators. In nuclear strategy, latency is power. Who is insisting on timeline control? Who is building the industrial base and human capital? Who is creating diplomatic cover? Who is forming relationships that introduce ambiguity? Those are the signals a state is buying options, not just technology. Third, understand the emotional trap. The region can look calmer until it doesn't. Outsourced deterrence can reduce visible conflict while raising the risk of sudden panic. The danger is the jump from managed tension to unmanaged crisis when everyone discovers the ambiguity is real at the same time. And now the final warning, keep it sharp, not slow. Saudi Arabia's $0 nuclear shield is not about going nuclear tomorrow. It's about making the region behave as if Saudi Arabia already has nuclear backing, while keeping maximum freedom to deny, delay, and negotiate. That is the pattern. Foundation, overextension, fracture, hedge. It's the same machine that built umbrellas after World War II. The same credibility trap that taught regimes to keep options. The same lesson that paper assurances can fail when interests shift. And the reason this matters right now is simple. Once a state proves it can get nuclear-shaped deterrence without becoming a declared nuclear state, others copy the method. The blueprint spreads faster than a weapons program because the blueprint is diplomatic and strategic. It's cheaper, it's easier to hide, and it's easier to justify. So if you want to understand what happens next, you need to ask the only question that matters. When the next crisis hits, when the region faces a real test, who actually pays the credibility bill? Who shows up? Who risks what? Because that answer determines whether the $0 nuclear shield is a stabilizer or the trigger for the next stage of the machine. Subscribe if you want the next piece, because the next video is where we map how this machine was built, why deterrence migrates toward ambiguity in high-debt eras, and what the next stage looks like when every player starts buying protection through deniable contracts instead of declared weapons.